Hi friends, and welcome to my channel. Today, I'm bringing you two unbelievable stories where the actions of the criminals are nothing short of shocking. The first story is about a woman who went to unimaginable lengths for her own gain. She not only resorted to murder, but also did something absolutely unthinkable to achieve her goal. Her actions are chilling in their cold-bloodedness and inhumanity. The second story is about a group of teenagers who, in their pursuit of easy money, got themselves into a dangerous scheme and committed a horrifying crime. They were convinced their plan was flawless, but everything went in a completely unexpected direction. These stories are a stark reminder that greed and reckless decisions can lead to devastating consequences. So, get comfortable because the endings of these tales are guaranteed to surprise you. The quiet, peaceful village of Soryeonri in the Wondong district of Yongsan City, Gyeongnam Province, a place where life always moved at its own pace until April 16, 2022, when men in uniforms with KCSI emblazoned on their backs, the Korean Police Scientific Investigation Service, arrived. Wasting no time, the investigators headed to a nearby field and began digging, as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. But the work quickly became challenging. Large stones obstructed the path, and each had to be manually hauled aside. Time dragged on, and only at a depth of about 6 feet did a shovel strike something unusual. The find was nothing short of shocking. A human body. On the deceased's thumb remained a red ink stain, adding a haunting element to the discovery. This was a murder, the likes of which no one in this small village had ever encountered. The victim was soon identified as a 55-year-old doctor named Choi, who resided in the Gyeomjonggu district of Busan. His disappearance had been reported on April 7th, about 9 days prior. On April 6th, around 8 in the evening, Choi had told his wife, "I'm stepping out briefly to meet an acquaintance," and left the house. Since then, no one had seen him. Growing increasingly worried, his wife called friends and family, but no one knew Choi's whereabouts. Worse, he didn't show up for work at the hospital the next day. The situation grew more alarming until his wife finally filed a missing persons report. A 55-year-old man leaving for a meeting and not returning could initially appear to be a typical disappearance, or even a case of someone leaving voluntarily. But Busan police took this report seriously. They immediately launched an investigation, tracing Choi's last known movements and reviewing surveillance footage. The footage showed Choi leaving his home and walking down the sidewalk, until he vanished without a trace. Where did he go? Choi's sudden disappearance along the road suggested he might have gotten into a car. The police decided to scrutinize every vehicle that passed near the area around the time he was last seen. They checked all the license plates, contacted the owners, and asked each of them, "Do you know Choi?" Gradually narrowing down the list of suspects, they encountered a peculiar reaction. One vehicle owner claimed he wasn't in the area at that time, though his car's license plate had been captured on surveillance footage. Had his car been stolen? The car owner's alibi was airtight, and further investigation revealed that someone had merely duplicated his license plate. This was deeply suspicious. The police immediately began tracking the car that appeared on the footage, eventually tracing it to the remote village of Soryeonri in the Wondong district of Yongsan, approximately 19 miles from the victim's home. It was a very rural area with almost no surveillance cameras. However, something significant might have happened here, and the police began interviewing the local residents. Finally, they discovered that a container on one of the farms was equipped with a surveillance camera that provided a view of the entire village. Moreover, this recording had captured the very vehicle they were looking for. It seemed like they had finally found the long-awaited lead. However, a new problem emerged. It had been too dark that night, and although they could see the car moving and then stopping, it was impossible to determine the exact spot where it had come to a halt. The police, meticulously analyzing the situation, reviewed the faint glow of the car's headlights on the footage repeatedly, conducting dozens, even hundreds of analyses. They compared frames taken under various lighting conditions, attempting from multiple angles to identify the location where the vehicle had stopped. And do you know why the police were so persistent in their analyses? By the time the investigation reached this point, Choi had been missing for about a week, and during that time there had been no signs of life from him. This led to a sinister thought that Choi might already be dead. It was suspected that the place where the suspect's car had stopped could be the location where his remains were buried. Sumu-san, the detective responsible for the investigation, personally visited all the places where he thought the vehicle might have stopped. Yet everything looked like ordinary wasteland. How could a body be hidden on such open land? Then, one detail caught Detective Su's eye. It was a slightly rusted cola can. This was very significant. Why did this raise suspicion? The wasteland where they were searching was dry, even barren land with no hint of moisture. Yet the can was rusted, indicating it had been in a damp environment. Perhaps initially, this can had not been on the surface but buried in moist soil. This led to the thought that the ground might have been recently disturbed. Detective Su's analysis proved accurate. A quick survey of the local residents revealed that an excavator had recently been working at the site, digging a hole. The police immediately began searching for the landowner, who turned out to be a certain Mr. An. Mr. An readily admitted, "Yes, we recently dug a hole here." When asked why he had done this, he explained it was at the request of an acquaintance who wanted to plant a tree. And who was this acquaintance? It was a woman by the name of Shim, around 40 years old. According to Mr. An, on March 31st, a few days before Choi's disappearance, Shim had called him. She said she had brought a beautiful ornamental tree from Seoul and asked if she could plant it on Mr. An's land for a couple of years. Since the plot was an abandoned agricultural field, Mr. An agreed without hesitation. 3 days later, on April 3rd, an excavator arrived at the site to dig a hole 1.3 meters deep and 2.5 meters wide. Both Mr. An and Shim were present at the scene, but interestingly, no tree is currently in that spot, just barren land. When Detective Su asked what had happened, Mr. An explained that Shim had called a few days after the hole was dug and told him there were issues with the tree's delivery, so she couldn't bring it. Consequently, they had to fill the hole back in. Detective Su, analyzing this information, became convinced that Choi's body might be in that hole. He suggested to Mr. An that they dig it up again, but Mr. An exclaimed, "What are you talking about? This is utterly absurd," and firmly refused to believe the police's suspicions. He added that, as far as he knew, Miss Shim was a successful attorney, a kind and sincere person who could never be involved in something as horrific as murder. The police insisted that if they excavated the area and found no body, they would restore everything to its original condition. With this assurance and under police pressure, a large-scale search operation involving forensic experts began. This took place on April 16th. Ultimately, Detective Su's suspicions were entirely confirmed. When they dug about 6 feet deep, they uncovered the body of the missing Choi. Mr. An was present during the excavation, and he was so stunned by the discovery that he simply collapsed to the ground. After the body was discovered, Shim became the primary suspect. She was immediately detained by the police. Initially, Shim denied any involvement in the events, but the police had surveillance footage as well as Mr. An's testimony, both of which implicated her. She had no way out, and in the end, she confessed. She admitted to killing Choi and then hiding his body in the pit. Then, more was uncovered about Shim's life. Shim, known to everyone as a lawyer, was actually a regular housewife. She was actively involved in online investment platforms related to stocks and presented herself as a specialist in securities law. Moreover, she often boasted that her parents were high-ranking government officials and that her brother was a doctor, creating an illusion of a successful life. In the end, it turned out that all of this was a lie. Unfortunately, Choi fell for this deception. He completely trusted Shim, believing her to be a lawyer, and invested a substantial amount of money into her project. Initially, when the first investments were made, Shim did indeed pay him monthly returns, transferring hundreds of thousands of won on time each month. This only strengthened his trust in her, and this continued until April 2017. The two decided that their projects were going so well that they should open an office to manage their affairs. They ended up acquiring a studio apartment in the city of Yongsan, Gyeongnam Province. At the time, Choi paid the deposit for the apartment, while Shim agreed to cover the monthly rent. Thus, their stock investment seemed to be running smoothly. However, time passed, and the economy took a sharp downturn. Stock prices began to fall. During this time, Choi, who was a doctor, was so occupied with his primary job that he couldn't give his investments the attention they needed. He was firmly convinced that Shim was handling everything, as she had consistently delivered positive results. Then, on March 28th, 2022, Choi received an unexpected phone call from the owner of the apartment. He learned that the rent was overdue. Shim was supposed to handle the rent payments, and this raised Choi's suspicions that things were going badly. As he investigated, he discovered that Shim had suffered enormous losses and simply didn't have the money to cover the rent. Only then did Choi realize that all the money he had invested, amounting to hundreds of millions of won, was gone. Furthermore, it was revealed that Shim had used 100 million won, which was meant for investments on her personal expenses. Choi was furious. He called Shim and demanded she immediately return the 100 million won. He also threatened that if she didn't repay him, he would reveal everything to her husband. This terrified Shim. She had already lost significant sums on stocks in the past, and it had strained her relationship with her husband to the breaking point. They had been on the verge of divorce, and Shim had sworn to her husband that she would never engage in investments again. If Choi told her husband about these latest losses, it would be catastrophic, but she couldn't return the money to Choi because she simply didn't have it. Cornered, Shim arrived at a desperate conclusion. I have to kill Choi. She asked him for a little more time, until April 6th. Now she had a week. But instead of looking for the money, she focused on finding a place to hide the body. Shim remembered that an acquaintance had a piece of land in a rural village, and saying she wanted to plant a decorative tree, arranged to rent it. She began preparing the site in advance. Her plan was progressing successfully. On the day of the crime, April 6th, Shim borrowed a car from her acquaintance and had already placed fake license plates on it. She approached the task with meticulous care. Inside the vehicle was a backpack containing a rope she intended to use in the murder. Additionally, Shim prepared clothes and a wig, likely to evade the police after the crime. At 8:07, Shim met Choi near his home in Gyeomjonggu, Busan, and he got into the car. She suggested they go somewhere quiet to talk peacefully, and drove to a parking lot in Cheongmyeon-dong. Soon, they moved to the back seat to have their conversation. Shim explained to Choi that she didn't have the 100 million won to repay him, but could pay him 1 million won a month. However, Choi grew angry, saying this wasn't what they had agreed upon, and demanded the entire sum. I can't talk to you anymore, take me home, he said, moving to the front passenger seat. This was the moment Shim had been waiting for. As soon as Choi sat in the front seat, Shim pulled out the rope she had prepared and began to strangle him from behind, pulling it with all her strength. The sudden attack caught Choi off guard, and though he tried to fight back, it was in vain. Within minutes, Choi stopped breathing. Perhaps he never imagined he would fall victim to an assault in the company of a woman. Shim's plan had been that thorough. Afterward, Shim drove to the pre-dug grave in Soryeonri and dumped Choi's body into it. The pit was so deep that filling it in on her own was nearly impossible, so she just covered the body with a thin layer of soil to keep it hidden and left. A few days later, Shim planned to return and ask the landowner to have the excavator fill the hole again, explaining that the tree delivery had fallen through and planting was no longer needed. Quite a bold plan, wasn't it? Shim considered it the perfect crime. The village was so remote that there were no surveillance cameras, and the car she had used was rented with fake license plates. But remember the red fingerprint on the body's thumb? There's an intriguing story behind that print. Shim felt certain that she had hidden the body well and was relatively at ease. But then, she received a call from Choi's wife. The wife was desperately searching for her husband, and already knew that Shim and Choi had financial dealings. She asked Shim if she had seen her husband or knew anything about his whereabouts. Shim quickly fabricated a lie. We wrapped up all our dealings years ago. I can even send you a contract to confirm it. Naturally, no such contract existed, so Shim hastily forged a document. In this contract, it stated that all financial relationships between Shim and Choi had ended in 2018. However, actual records indicated that their business dealings continued beyond 2018. To reinforce her lie, Shim added a clause that from July to December 2021, she paid him $4 million monthly. The contract included a provision stating that, in the event of Choi's death, all remaining investments would transfer to Shim. She had killed a man, but her greed knew no bounds. She wanted to claim every last penny. After preparing the contract, Shim signed it and affixed her seal. But there was one problem. She needed Choi's fingerprint. So Shim returned to the burial site in Soryeonri, where Choi's body lay hidden. On April 7th, Shim arrived at the burial site and began digging up the earth she had covered the body with the previous night. Choi's corpse was uncovered. Shim quickly inked the left thumb of the deceased and pressed his fingerprint onto the contract. Then, she reburied the body and left. It feels so brutal and inhumane that it's hard to fathom. Afterward, Shim sent a copy of the forged contract to Choi's wife, and then asked the landowner, Mr. An, to fill in the hole permanently. She believed she had committed the perfect crime and lived calmly for about 10 days, convinced that no one would uncover her actions. But in the end, she was apprehended. Shim's trial took place in October 2022. The judges emphasized that the murder had been meticulously premeditated. Furthermore, Shim used the fingerprint of a dead man to forge an official document, which added an additional layer of insult to the memory of the deceased. For all of this, Shim was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, Shim considered this sentence too harsh and filed an appeal. In May 2023, the Supreme Court decided to reduce her sentence to 30 years. The court acknowledged that Shim's crime was extremely severe, but the method of killing was not deemed so brutal as to warrant life imprisonment, and no further evidence of her guilt was found that could justify her complete isolation from society. Shim, who for years deceived people, embezzled funds, and plotted murder, ultimately faced punishment for all her crimes. She didn't stop even there. She used the fingerprint of a dead man. Perhaps at every stage of this crime, her mind was consumed by greed alone. Money is one aspect of human happiness, but as this case shows, it can also become the most potent force, turning a person cruel and despicable. And now, on to the second story. Stay tuned. Let me know your thoughts on this story in the comments. I'm really curious to hear your opinions. None of the stories on my channel are created by AI. These are real cases that happened to real people. In the early hours of May 20th, 2006, the body of a woman was discovered in an old house slated for demolition in the Beizhi Nanxi district. The condition of the victim was so horrifying that identifying her was nearly impossible. Her clothing was half torn, and her face and body were so severely beaten they were swollen and unrecognizable. Additionally, there were burn marks visible on her head and lower body. Those who found the body initially speculated that she might have been the victim of a brutal act of revenge, or possibly killed by members of a criminal gang. Before long, the victim's identity was confirmed. She was 36-year-old Ding Xiaoen, a housewife who led a quiet and peaceful family life in Beijing. She had married her hometown sweetheart in 1992, and they had one son. Together, they managed a small supermarket, living a modest but happy life. As their son grew older, they decided to move to Beijing in 2000 to earn a better living and give him the opportunity to grow up in the city. In Beijing, Ding Xiaoen found a job at the same company where her younger brother worked. The tragedy is believed to have occurred around 1 a.m. on May 21, 2006. That night, Ding Xiaoen was worried because her husband hadn't returned home from a work party nearby. When it began to rain, she remembered that he had left without an umbrella, so she called him. "Honey, I'll wait outside for you with an umbrella. Hurry up." It was a gesture that reflected their mutual care, a defining characteristic of their relationship. But this call would be the last sound her husband would ever hear from her. Her husband, Liang Mengsheng, returned home at dawn. Outside, he didn't see his wife, who had promised to wait for him with an umbrella. Assuming he had taken too long, he thought she must have gone back inside. Yet upon entering, he found she wasn't there either. He tried calling her, but the phone just rang and no one picked up. He figured she might have been upset with his late return and had gone to spend the night at her brother's nearby. Not thinking much of it, he went to bed. The next morning, Liang Mengsheng headed toward his brother-in-law's place, but as he walked a short distance, He noticed a crowd of police officers and onlookers near an abandoned building close to their home. Out of curiosity, he went closer, pushing through the crowd to catch a glimpse of someone lying on the ground. In that moment, his heart stopped. He immediately recognized the figure as his wife. Almost losing his mind, Liang Mengsheng tried to reach her body, but investigators blocked his way. He pleaded, insisting it was his wife, begging them to let him confirm, but the detectives barred his path. The reason was grim. The body had been so brutally damaged that it was far too horrific for any relative to see. Who could commit such a brutal act, killing a wife and mother right on her doorstep? After this tragic event, Ding Xiaowen's family fell apart. Her 14-year-old son was unable to cope with the loss of his mother. His life became unbearable, and he even developed dyslexia as a result of the trauma. Ding Xiaowen's parents were so devastated that they fainted upon hearing the news. But it was her husband, Liang Mengsheng, who suffered most deeply, haunted by guilt, constantly thinking that if he had only come home a little earlier, he might have prevented this terrible tragedy. Ding Xiaowen's parents, who had lost their only daughter, were so overwhelmed by grief that they lost consciousness. But it was Liang Mengsheng who was most affected. Although he had a legitimate reason for his delay, a work dinner, he couldn't shake the gnawing guilt. If only I had come home a bit earlier, if only I had hurried. He felt as though the entire incident was somehow his fault. Meanwhile, the investigation turned out to be far more challenging than anticipated. Unfortunately, there were no surveillance cameras at the scene. The area was being prepped for demolition, and no one had deemed it necessary to install cameras. Ironically, it's places like these where crime risks run high that need cameras the most, yet none were present here. Moreover, no witnesses came forward, adding further complications to the investigation. The police then decided to widen their search radius and conduct interviews around the neighborhood. During this process, they discovered that on the same day as the murder, another assault had taken place in the same area. This victim had also been beaten, and notably had suffered burns. The detectives thought, isn't this too similar to be a coincidence? Fortunately, there was a surveillance camera at the second crime scene. The police began reviewing the footage, hoping to spot suspects, and discovered that the assault had been carried out by not one, but 4 individuals, 2 young men and 2 young women, all of them minors. Shortly afterward, the group was apprehended at an internet cafe where they were calmly playing games. During their arrest, none of them showed the slightest hint of remorse. The police arrested them based on the assault captured on camera, but soon began questioning them about the murder of housewife Ding Xiaowen. And to everyone's shock, the suspects confessed almost immediately. Yeah, we did that too. Their confession came so casually that it left the officers stunned. When asked, "Why did you do it?" one of them responded in chilling fashion, "Well, we were bored. Listening to screams, it's kind of thrilling." In the early stages of the investigation, everyone believed this was a crime driven by vengeance, given how cruelly and grotesquely the body had been mutilated. However, it soon became clear that there was no connection whatsoever between the killers and the victim. They had murdered her purely for amusement. Unable to contain themselves, the police asked, "Aren't you afraid of ending up in prison?" The teen's response was even more shocking. "No, we're too young for anyone to be scared of us." These 4 teenagers were true monsters. 2 of them were 17-year-old twin brothers named Niao Delay and Niao Xiaoxi. The brothers, Niao Delay and Niao Xiaoxi, came from a poor family of the Miao ethnic minority. Due to poverty, they hadn't even received basic education. Their parents had split up early on, leaving the brothers with their father, who was too preoccupied to care for them. When he returned home, he would simply throw them some money and say, "Cook for yourselves." This lack of attention led the brothers to become problem students at school until they eventually dropped out. After that, they started making a living through petty theft. Despite their troubled lives, they even managed to find girlfriends. The 2 girls arrested with them had met the brothers at an internet cafe. One of them, Yan Lina, was 19, while the other, Lei Ruan, was 16. Both girls were runaways, teenagers who had fled their homes. The Niao brothers even brought them to live in their house. Their father only came home to sleep, so they felt they could do whatever they wanted. When their father finally noticed what was going on, he was furious, but the brothers simply ignored him. They figured that as long as they stayed out of his way, there would be no problems. During the day when their father was at work, the teens would hang out at home, and in the evening when their father was expected back, they'd go out to roam the neighborhood. If they had money, they would head to karaoke bars or internet cafes. But when their cash ran out, they started looking for ways to get more. Eventually, they settled on robbery. They decided they would simply intimidate people and take their money. On the day of the incident, they wandered through deserted alleys, attacking 5 passers-by and successfully robbing each one. All of this was done in a single day, and it turned out to be so profitable that they were stunned. Why didn't we think of this sooner? But even robbing 5 people in one day wasn't enough, so they immediately began looking for another target. It was then they noticed Ding Xiaowen, standing on the roadside in the early morning hours, waiting for her husband. That day, Ding Xiaowen noticed the 4 teenagers approaching her. Their young faces looked harmless, so she paid them little mind. But suddenly they surrounded her, blocking her path. Ding Xiaowen glanced around, bewildered, trying to understand what was happening when one of the girls, Lina, suddenly lunged at her. The 2 of them fell to the ground. Not missing a beat, the older twin, Niao Dalei, stepped up to them, glaring at Ding Xiaowen in irritation and shouted, "Auntie, you knocked over my girlfriend." It was absurd. They were the ones who had staged the attack. Ding Xiaowen tried to explain it wasn't her fault, but the teenagers were intent on aggression. Niao Dalei, without hesitation, slapped her across the face and demanded she hand over all her money. Surrounded by the 4 teenagers, Ding Xiaowen felt a surge of terror and quickly pulled out about 20,000 won from her pocket. But the teens just laughed. "Auntie, is that all?" Niao Dalei began searching her and took her cell phone. It seemed they had taken all they could, and Ding Xiaowen hoped they would leave her alone. But instead, one of the brothers picked up a stick lying nearby and started beating her. Even after they had taken all her money and belongings, the violence did not stop. Ding Xiaowen pleaded with them, saying she had a 14-year-old son, someone their own age, and that she could be their mother. But the crazed teens paid her no mind. When Lina heard her mention she was a mother, it only fueled her rage, and she began beating her even more brutally. Lina bore her own pain. Her parents had abandoned her after their divorce, shifting responsibility onto each other. Ding Xiaowen's words about being a mother struck a raw nerve, sparking a wave of anger in Lina. The 4 teens continued their merciless assault on Ding Xiaowen. They laughed, passing the stick among themselves as if it were some kind of twisted game. They were like true demons, reveling in their brutality. At one point, they even stripped her, exposing her body. Niao Dalei pulled out a lighter and set her hair and lower body on fire. Ding Xiaowen screamed in agony, begging for mercy, but the teens seemed to feel neither fear nor hesitation, only a mad thrill in what they were doing. The scene was truly horrifying, yet was there not a single witness? In reality, some local residents had heard her cries for help, but no one ventured outside. Cars drove by, but no one stopped to help the woman who was being savagely beaten. Over time, Ding Xiaowen's screams faded and she fell still. Only then did the teenagers search her pockets, take any remaining money, and calmly walk away. During their interrogation, the perpetrators said, "We didn't intend to kill her. We just got carried away with the beating." The teenagers claimed they hadn't intended to kill Ding Xiaowen. "We just got too carried away, beating her until she lost consciousness," Niao Dalei explained. According to him, they had attacked 6 people that day, including Ding Xiaowen. Their first victim was an elderly woman collecting cardboard. They set her clothes on fire, and finding it so funny, they continued their spree, beating 4 more people. By the time they encountered Ding Xiaowen, they had reached the peak of their sadistic thrill, leading to the horrific actions that left her body in such a brutalized state. What was truly shocking was Niao Dalei's behavior during his interrogation. As he recounted beating and setting his victims on fire, he couldn't stop laughing, constantly raising his eyebrows and mockingly saying, "I spun around and punched her right in the stomach and she just crumpled like a rag doll." A chilling image, a murder committed by 4 minors. But how did their trial conclude? Were they able to escape punishment because of their age? At the first hearing, Niao Dalei and Yen Lina, identified as the ringleaders, were each sentenced to 17 years for grievous bodily harm and robbery. The younger brother, Niao Xiaoxi, received 14 years in prison, while Lei Ruan, who was not yet 16 at the time of the crime, was sentenced to 9 years. Although all of them were minors, the court imposed significant sentences. However, Ding Xiaowen's family, especially her husband, Liang Mingsheng, couldn't accept the court's decision. They felt the punishment was far too lenient for such a heinous crime. Liang Mingsheng filed an appeal. At the second hearing, Niao Dalei's sentence was increased to life imprisonment due to the particular cruelty of his actions. Yet the sentences for the other defendants remained unchanged. At this point, the parents of the perpetrators stepped forward, pleading for leniency. Please forgive them. They grew up in extreme poverty and lacked proper education. Such self-centered justifications sounded absurd. After all, it was their careless parenting that led to the death of an innocent person. The father of the twin brothers, Niao, also spoke in an interview, blaming poverty for what had happened. "I would like to compensate the victim's family, but I don't have enough money even for food and clothing. All I can do is offer my apologies." The father continued with his excuses. "I don't even have money for food or clothes, so there's nothing I can do except sincerely apologize." But could this really be called a genuine apology? Or was it just a ploy to elicit sympathy? It's hard to say. 4 teenagers killed a stranger just for fun. Were they born monsters? Or was it society's indifference and the neglect of adults that turned them into what they became? We don't know the exact answer, but it seems that if there had been adults around who had given them the proper attention and raised them responsibly, this tragedy might never have happened. The final verdict in this case was handed down in January 2008. 16 years have now passed, and 2 of the perpetrators have already been released and are living ordinary lives. The remaining 2 are still in prison. But have they truly come to understand the gravity of their crimes?